My name is Christopher Hughes. I am 20 years old, a sophomore business major at Central State University, and the summer I turned 19, I watched my uncle systematically steal a 40-year-old construction company from my grandfather while dementia slowly erased the old man's ability to fight back. Everyone told me I was too young to understand what was happening, too inexperienced to challenge a successful businessman with expensive lawyers. But they were wrong, because what I lacked in experience, I made up for with determination, a smartphone that could record conversations, and one very thorough Business Law 201 class that taught me exactly what fraud looked like. This is the story of how I took on my own family to protect the legacy my grandfather built with his bare hands, and how I learned that sometimes being young means people underestimate you right up until the moment you prove them catastrophically wrong. My grandfather, William Hughes, was a legend in our town of Millbrook. He had started Hughes Construction in 1983 with nothing but a pickup truck, a toolbox, and an immigrant's dream of building something that would last. His parents had come to America from Ireland in the 1950s with almost nothing, and he had grown up watching them work multiple jobs just to keep food on the table. He swore he would build something permanent, something that could not be taken away, something that would give his children and grandchildren the stability his parents never had. Over 4 decades, he had turned that one-man operation into a company with 75 employees, 25 trucks, and contracts all over the state. He built schools where children learned, hospitals where babies were born, shopping centers where families gathered. He built half the infrastructure of Millbrook itself. The elementary school I attended, the library where my mother worked, the community center where I played basketball as a kid, all bore the Hughes Construction signature. You could not drive through our town without seeing something my grandfather had built with his own hands. He was the kind of man who still remembered every employee's name, even the ones who had worked for him decades ago. He showed up at job sites at 5 in the morning, even when he did not need to, not to supervise, but to work alongside his crew, mixing concrete, or carrying lumber, or operating heavy machinery. He believed that a handshake was as binding as any contract, and in 40 years of business, he had never been sued, never defaulted on a project, never left a client dissatisfied. His reputation was built on integrity, craftsmanship, and an old-fashioned work ethic that seemed increasingly rare in the modern world. He was also my hero. My parents had divorced when I was 7, one of those bitter separations that leave scars on everyone involved. My father had moved to another state and gradually faded from my life until he was little more than a signature on birthday cards and the occasional awkward phone call. My mother had struggled to raise me and my younger sister Emma on a teacher's salary, working second jobs during summers and tutoring in the evenings just to make ends meet. My grandfather had been the steady presence in our lives during those difficult years, the one who made sure we had what we needed. He paid for my braces when my mother could not afford them. He bought me my first car, a beat-up Honda that he taught me to maintain myself. He took me to job sites on weekends and school breaks, showing me what real work looked like, teaching me that there was dignity in building things, in creating something tangible and lasting. When I got accepted to Central State University to study business, he set up a college fund without being asked, telling me that education was the one investment that could never be taken away. He taught me that hard work and integrity were the only things that really mattered in life, not money, though he had made plenty of it, not status, though he was respected throughout the county, but the knowledge that you had done right by people, that you had kept your word, that you had built something worth building. Those lessons shaped who I became, and they were the reason I could not stand by and watch what happened to him, which is why it destroyed me to watch Alzheimer's disease slowly steal him away. It started small, the way these things always do. Forgotten names, repeated stories, misplaced keys. We all made excuses at first, because acknowledging the truth was too painful. He was 72, still working full-time. Obviously, he was tired. Obviously, he was stressed. Obviously, it was normal to be a little forgetful at that age. But looking back, the signs were there long before we admitted them. I remember coming home from high school during my senior year and finding Grandpa standing in his driveway, staring at his truck with a confused expression. When I asked if he was okay, he said he could not remember where he had been planning to go. Just could not remember. He stood there for almost 10 minutes trying to recall what errand had been so important 5 minutes earlier, and the frustration and fear on his face was heartbreaking. There was the time he showed up at a job site and could not remember any of his employees' names, men he had worked with for years. Danny Morrison, his foreman of 2 decades, had to gently remind him who everyone was. Danny called my mother that night, his voice heavy with concern, saying something was not right with the boss. There was the afternoon he called me 3 times in an hour asking the same question about whether I had applied to colleges yet, forgetting each previous conversation completely. There was the morning my mother found him, trying to make breakfast at 2 a.m, confused about what time it was. There was the business meeting where he signed the same document 4 times because he kept forgetting he had already signed it. By my freshman year of college, we could not ignore it anymore. Grandpa would forget appointments with clients, showing up on the wrong day or at the wrong location. He would lose track of conversations mid-sentence, his thoughts trailing off into confused silence. He would become disoriented in places he had known for decades, forgetting how to get home from the office he had worked in for 40 years. He started having moments of paranoia, accusing employees of stealing from him when they had not, misplacing things, and then creating elaborate theories about who had taken them. The diagnosis came in October of my freshman year, during fall break, when I came home to visit. Alzheimer's disease, early stage but progressing rapidly. The neurologist, a kind woman in her 50s, explained that the disease would continue to deteriorate his cognitive function, that there was no cure, that we should prepare for a decline that could take anywhere from 3 to 10 years. She said he might have moments of clarity mixed with increasing confusion, that he would lose recent memories first and then gradually lose older ones, that eventually he would forget even the most basic things about his life and identity. I watched my grandfather's face as the doctor explained his prognosis, and I saw something I had never seen before in this man who had always been so strong, so capable, so in control. I saw fear, real, deep fear of what was coming, of losing himself piece by piece, while still being aware enough to know what he was losing. The family had gathered at Grandpa's house to discuss what this meant, what we needed to do to take care of him and manage the business he had built. I was home for fall break, sitting quietly in the corner of his living room while the adults talked. My mother was there, along with her 3 siblings, Uncle Robert, Uncle James, and Aunt Linda. They were discussing long-term care options, power of attorney, succession plans for the business. Uncle Robert, the oldest of my mother's siblings at 55, had always been the self-appointed leader of the family. He was a real estate lawyer with a successful practice, expensive suits, and an air of superiority that made it clear he thought he was smarter than everyone else in the room. He had never worked for Hughes Construction, had never gotten his hands dirty on a job site, but he spoke with absolute authority about what needed to happen. The reality is that Dad cannot run the company anymore, Uncle Robert said, standing at the head of the room like he was addressing a jury. His condition is only going to get worse. We need to act now, before he makes decisions that could destroy everything he has built. I propose that we establish a conservatorship, with me as the primary conservator. I will handle all the legal and financial aspects of the business and Dad's personal affairs. It is what I am trained to do, and it makes the most sense. My mother looked uncertain. Should we not discuss this with Dad first? Ask him what he wants. Mom, he has dementia, Uncle Robert said, his voice dripping with condescension. He cannot make rational decisions anymore. That is the whole point. We need to protect him from himself. Uncle James, who was 52 and worked as an accountant, nodded in agreement. Robert is right. We need someone with legal expertise to manage this properly. Dad would want us to keep the business running smoothly. Aunt Linda, the youngest at 48 and a nurse, looked troubled. I am just worried about moving too fast. Dad is still pretty functional most of the time. Maybe we should wait, see how he does. Involve him in these decisions as much as we can. That is your emotions talking, not logic, Uncle Robert said dismissively. Every day we wait is a day Dad could sign a bad contract, make a poor financial decision, put the entire company at risk. We need to act decisively. I raised my hand like I was in class, feeling stupid the moment I did it. Does not Grandpa get a say in who manages his affairs? I thought conservatorship required the person's consent or a court order. Uncle Robert looked at me with barely concealed annoyance. Thank you for the legal opinion, Christopher, but this is a family matter for the adults to decide. Why do not you go see if your grandfather needs anything? I felt my face flush with embarrassment and anger, but I was 18 years old and I had learned not to argue with Uncle Robert. He had a way of making you feel small, of dismissing your concerns like they were childish and ignorant. So I left the room and went to find my grandfather. I found him in his study, surrounded by the memorabilia of 40 years in business. Framed photos of construction projects, awards from the Chamber of Commerce, a wall of hard hats signed by employees who had worked for him over the decades. He was sitting at his desk, looking through old contracts with a confused expression. "Hey, Grandpa," I said gently. "How are you doing?" He looked up, and his face brightened with recognition. "Christopher, my boy, when did you get here?" "Yesterday, Grandpa. I am home for fall break, remember?" "Fall break. Right. He nodded, but I could see he did not actually remember. "How is school? You are studying business, right? Going to take over the company someday." My throat tightened. This was the dream he had held for years, that one of his grandchildren would inherit Hughes Construction and carry on what he had built. But with the dementia progressing, that dream seemed more and more impossible. I am studying business, yeah. Still figuring out what I want to do after graduation. You should work for me. Learn the business from the ground up like I did. There is nothing like building something with your own hands, Christopher. Nothing like seeing a project through from blueprint to ribbon cutting. It is real work, honest work, not like these lawyers and accountants who push papers around. He said this last part with a bit of disdain, and I realized he was probably thinking of Uncle Robert. "Grandpa, can I ask you something? Have you thought about what you want to happen with the company? Like, if you cannot run it anymore, who do you want to take over?" His expression became troubled, confused. "Cannot run it? What are you talking about? I run Hughes Construction. I am the owner." I know. I just meant, like, in the future, if you ever wanted to retire or needed help managing things. I already have managers. Good people. Been with me for years. Danny Morrison has been my foreman for 20 years. Sarah Chun handles all the office operations. I trust them completely. What about family? Do you want someone from the family to be involved? He frowned, struggling to follow the thread of the conversation. Family is important, but business is business. You need people who know what they are doing, not people who just want a paycheck because they share your last name. It was one of his lucid moments, a flash of the sharp businessman he had been before the disease started taking him. I seized the opportunity. "So you would not want, like, Uncle Robert managing the company?" "Robert? Grandpa laughed, a short, bitter sound. Robert has never built anything in his life. He is a lawyer. He knows how to argue and bill by the hour, but he does not know the first thing about running a construction company. Why would I want him involved? He is talking about getting conservatorship, managing your finances and business decisions. The confusion returned to Grandpa's face, the lucidity fading as quickly as it had appeared. Conservatorship? What does that mean? It means someone else would make decisions for you. Legal and financial decisions. But why? I make my own decisions. I always have. I know, Grandpa. I know. He looked at me with sudden, heartbreaking clarity. Christopher, I am losing my mind. I can feel it happening. Some days I cannot remember what I did yesterday, or what year it is, or whether I already had breakfast. But I am not gone yet. I am still here, and I do not want people making decisions about my life like I am already dead. Then we need to make sure your wishes are documented. Legal documents that say what you want, while you are still able to say it. Can you help me with that? I was 18 years old. I had completed exactly 0 semesters of college. I knew nothing about conservatorship or estate planning or elder law. But I looked at my grandfather, this man who had given me so much, who was slowly disappearing into the fog of dementia, and I said yes. I said I would help him, because what else could I say? Over the next few weeks, I did research. I learned about advance directives, durable powers of attorney, healthcare proxies, living wills. I learned that my grandfather still had the right to make his own decisions as long as he was deemed mentally competent, and that competency was a legal determination that required more than just a dementia diagnosis. I learned that he could designate someone to make decisions on his behalf if he became incapacitated, but that he got to choose who that person was. I brought this information to my mother, explaining that Grandpa should have his own lawyer, independent of Uncle Robert, to help him establish proper legal protections before his condition deteriorated further. My mother agreed. Thank God. She helped Grandpa hire an elder law attorney, a woman named Margaret Sullivan, who specialized in protecting the rights of people with cognitive decline. Attorney Sullivan met with Grandpa several times, carefully documenting his wishes while he was still lucid enough to express them. He established a power of attorney naming my mother and Aunt Linda as co-agents, specifically excluding Uncle Robert. He created an advance directive outlining his healthcare wishes. Most importantly, he established a trust for the business, with clear succession plans that prioritized keeping Hughes Construction operational with the existing management team rather than selling it or putting family members with no construction experience in charge. Uncle Robert was furious when he found out. There was a family dinner at Grandpa's house where he confronted my mother and Aunt Linda, demanding to know why he had been excluded from any decision-making authority. "This is unacceptable," he said, his face red with anger. "I am the oldest. I am the one with legal and business expertise. And you two, what, decided behind my back to cut me out?" "We did not cut you out, Robert," my mother said calmly. "Dad made these decisions himself, with the help of his attorney. He chose who he wanted to manage his affairs if he becomes incapacitated. Dad has dementia. He is not capable of making rational decisions." His attorney disagrees. She evaluated him thoroughly and determined he still has testamentary capacity. He knows what he owns, he knows who his family is, and he knows what he wants to happen with his estate. That is all that is required. "This is your doing," Uncle Robert said, pointing at my mother. "You poisoned him against me. You always were jealous that I was more successful than you. This is not about success, Robert. This is about respecting Dad's wishes." Uncle Robert turned his glare on me. "And you? This started with you, did it not? Putting ideas in Dad's head, making him paranoid, turning him against his own family. I just helped Grandpa find a lawyer," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, so he could make his own decisions about his life. You are a kid. You do not understand the complexity of managing a multi-million-dollar estate. You have caused a lot of problems with your meddling. If by meddling you mean helping Grandpa exercise his legal rights, then I guess I am guilty. Uncle Robert stepped toward me, and for a moment I thought he might actually physically intimidate me. But my mother moved between us. That is enough, Robert. Christopher did the right thing. And frankly, if you were more concerned about Dad's well-being and less concerned about controlling his money, maybe he would have chosen to include you in these arrangements. Uncle Robert looked at all of us with cold fury. You will regret this, all of you, when the business falls apart because it is being run by incompetence, when Dad's money is mismanaged, when there are lawsuits and creditors and chaos. Remember that I tried to prevent it. He left, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the windows. Aunt Linda looked shaken. He is really angry. He will get over it, my mother said, but she did not sound entirely convinced. Grandpa, who had been quiet throughout the confrontation, spoke up from his chair. Robert has always been about control. Even when he was a boy, he had to be in charge, had to be the boss. But this is my company. I built it, and I will decide what happens to it. At the time, I thought we had won. I thought we had protected Grandpa's interests and secured his legacy. I had no idea that Uncle Robert's anger was not just wounded pride. It was the fury of someone whose plan had been disrupted, someone who had already started counting money that was not yet his. And over the next year, while I was away at college learning about business principles and contract law, Uncle Robert was putting a new plan into motion. I came home for Christmas break during my sophomore year to find that things had changed dramatically. Grandpa's condition had deteriorated significantly. He was now in the moderate stage of Alzheimer's, requiring full-time care. He had moved into a memory care facility, a nice one that cost almost $8,000 a month. My mother visited him daily, managing his care and trying to keep some connection to the man he had been. But there was something else, something that became clear when I visited Hughes Construction's main office to drop off some documents for my mother. The office, which had always been bustling with activity, felt different, quieter, tenser. The usual sounds of phones ringing and people calling out to each other were muted, replaced by a heaviness I could not quite identify. I found Sarah Chun, the office manager who had worked for my grandfather for 15 years, looking stressed and exhausted at her desk. Sarah was normally one of those people who radiated positive energy, always smiling, always organized, always ready with a kind word. But today her desk was covered in files, and she had dark circles under her eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights. "Christopher, it is good to see you. How is college treating you?" she asked, but her smile did not reach her eyes. "Good, Sarah. How are things here? How is the company doing?" She glanced around the office, checking to see who might be listening, then lowered her voice and gestured for me to step into a small conference room. She closed the door behind us before speaking. "Honestly, not great. There have been a lot of changes in the past few months. Changes your grandfather never would have approved of. Changes that do not make sense from a business perspective." "What kind of changes?" Sarah pulled out a folder from under her arm, one she had clearly been keeping close. New vendors that charge twice what our old vendors charged. Contracts canceled that were profitable. Good long-term relationships your grandfather spent years building. Equipment being sold off. Some of our best machinery at prices way below market value. And the accounting, Christopher, the accounting is a mess. Things are not adding up the way they should. Who is making these decisions? That is the thing. Officially, your mother has power of attorney, and she is supposed to be overseeing major business decisions. But she is so overwhelmed with your grandfather's care, spending every day at the memory facility with him, managing his medical needs. She trusts the people around her to handle day-to-day operations, and your Uncle Robert has been using that trust. Uncle Robert? But he does not have any official role in the company. I know, but he has been coming around a lot, at least twice a week for the past few months. He brings his own lawyer and accountant to these meetings. He presents himself as the family representative, someone who is helping to protect the business during this difficult time. He is very persuasive, Christopher, very official. He has documents and presentations and spreadsheets. He makes everything sound so reasonable, so necessary. And people who do not know better believe him. I felt my stomach tighten. What exactly has he been doing? Sarah opened her folder and started showing me documents. See this? This is a contract with a new insurance provider. We switched from the company we had been with for 20 years, a company that gave us excellent rates because of our safety record. The new company charges 30% more, and when I looked into it, the new insurance company has ties to your uncle's law firm. They give his firm referral fees. She pulled out another document. This is a vendor contract for construction materials. Again, we left a long-time supplier who gave us bulk discounts and went with a new company that charges significantly more. I did some research. The owner of the new supply company went to law school with your Uncle Robert. They are old friends. Another document. This shows the sale of 3 excavators, backhoes that were only 5 years old and in perfect condition. Your grandfather bought those machines for $250,000 each. We sold them for $120,000 each to a company that, guess what, has financial ties to your uncle. She kept pulling out papers, each one showing a decision that enriched someone connected to Uncle Robert while diminishing the value of Hughes Construction. It was a pattern, systematic and deliberate. Have you shown this to my mother? I asked, my voice tight. I have tried. I have brought some of this to her attention. But Christopher, she is barely holding it together. Your grandfather is her whole focus right now, and she should not have to deal with this on top of everything else. Plus, your Uncle Robert tells her these are all routine business operations, strategic pivots that he and his team have carefully analyzed. He makes it sound so professional, so thought out. And your mom, she is a teacher, not a business person. She does not know what questions to ask. What about the other managers? What about Danny Morrison? Sarah's expression darkened, her lips pressing into a thin line. Danny quit 3 weeks ago. He had been your grandfather's right-hand man for 20 years, knew the construction business inside and out. He came to me before he left, really upset, said he could not be part of what was happening anymore, said the company was not the same place your grandfather built, that decisions were being made that did not serve the business or the employees, that something was deeply wrong. Did he say anything specific? He said that in 40 years with your grandfather, he never once saw a decision made that was not in the best interest of the company and the people who worked here. But in the 6 months since your grandfather's diagnosis became known, he had watched decision after decision that benefited outside parties at the company's expense. He said it felt like someone was looting the place, and he could not be part of it. Danny was not just a foreman, Christopher. He was the backbone of our operations. Losing him was catastrophic. Why did he not go to my mother? Why did he not report this? He tried. He wrote your mother a detailed letter outlining his concerns. But your Uncle Robert intercepted it, said Danny was just upset about changes to his compensation structure, that he was being disgruntled and unprofessional. He convinced your mother that Danny was the problem, not the solution. So Danny left, and with him went decades of institutional knowledge and the trust of the crew. Half the longtime employees are talking about leaving too. They do not recognize this company anymore. I spent the next hour talking to Sarah, getting details about every suspicious transaction, every questionable decision, every way that Uncle Robert had wormed his way into controlling Hughes Construction without actually having any legal authority to do so. The picture that emerged was of a man systematically extracting value from a company while its rightful owner slowly lost his mind in a nursing home, unable to stop what was happening or even understand that it was happening. I spent the next hour talking to Sarah, getting details about the specific changes Uncle Robert had implemented or influenced. New insurance policies with different beneficiaries, contracts with vendors that seemed overpriced, expense accounts that did not make sense, equipment sales that generated revenue but left the company with fewer assets. It all painted a troubling picture of someone systematically extracting value from the company while making it look like normal business operations. That night, I talked to my mother about what I had learned. She was exhausted, sitting at her kitchen table with stacks of medical bills and facility invoices, trying to manage the financial reality of long-term memory care. "Mom, I think Uncle Robert is stealing from Grandpa's company." She looked up at me, her expression weary. "Christopher, that is a serious accusation." "I know, but listen to what Sarah told me." I laid out everything I had learned, every suspicious transaction, every questionable decision. My mother listened, her face growing more troubled. Robert said he was helping. He said the company needed legal oversight to make sure everything was compliant with regulations. He has been meeting with the accountant to audit the books, to make sure everything is in order for when Dad passes. Her voice cracked on those last words. But he does not have the authority to make operational decisions. That is not auditing, that is management. And he is not a trustee of Grandpa's trust. He is my brother, Christopher, your uncle. He is family. Why would he steal from his own father? Because Grandpa's trust specifically excluded him from inheriting any part of the business. It goes to you, Aunt Linda and Uncle James. Robert gets assets and cash, but not the company. He was really angry about that, remember? My mother's face went pale. You think he is looting the company because he is not going to inherit it? I think we need to find out exactly what he has been doing, and we need to do it fast, before there is nothing left to inherit. The next day, I went back to Hughes Construction and asked Sarah for copies of everything. Financial statements, contracts, vendor agreements, expense reports, any document that showed the changes that had been implemented over the past 6 months. Sarah, bless her, gave me everything I asked for, saying she had been keeping meticulous records because something felt wrong and she wanted documentation. I spent the entire week of Christmas break going through these documents, and what I found made me physically sick. I set up a workspace in my childhood bedroom, covering my old desk with spreadsheets and contracts, staying up until 3 or 4 in the morning analyzing transactions and tracing money flows. I was learning more about forensic accounting from necessity than I had learned in any of my business classes. Over 6 months, Uncle Robert had systematically transferred wealth out of Hughes Construction through a web of transactions, so complex that it took me days to fully understand the scope. Each individual transaction looked defensible on its own, but taken together, they formed a clear pattern of theft. He had started with equipment sales, 3 excavators, sold at less than half their value to a company called Mountain State Equipment LLC. When I looked up Mountain State Equipment, I found that it had been incorporated just 2 months before the sale, and its registered agent was a lawyer at Uncle Robert's firm. The excavators, worth $750,000, had been sold for $360,000. The justification in the paperwork was that the equipment was aging and the company needed to reduce maintenance costs. But Sarah had shown me the maintenance logs. Those excavators were in perfect condition, and had at least 10 more years of productive life. Then there were the vendor contracts. Hughes Construction had spent 4 decades building relationships with suppliers, negotiating volume discounts and favorable payment terms. Those relationships represented real value, hundreds of thousands of dollars in savings every year. Uncle Robert had systematically canceled these contracts and replaced them with new vendors who charged significantly more. A lumber supplier who had given Grandpa a 20% discount for bulk purchases was replaced by a supplier who charged 15% above market rate. A concrete company that had been reliable and fairly priced for years was replaced by one that charged premium prices and had delivery problems that delayed projects. When I traced the ownership of these new vendors, I found connections to Uncle Robert everywhere. The new lumber supplier was owned by a real estate developer who had done multiple deals with Uncle Robert's firm. The concrete company was owned by the brother-in-law of one of Uncle Robert's law partners. The pattern was unmistakable. Uncle Robert was steering business to companies that would either give him kickbacks or owe him favors. But the most sophisticated part of the theft involved the real estate. Hughes Construction owned several valuable properties: the main office building, 2 equipment yards, and a warehouse. These properties had been purchased over decades and had appreciated significantly. They were worth, conservatively, about $3 million. Uncle Robert had convinced Uncle James, using falsified power of attorney documents, to transfer these properties into a new entity called Hughes Holdings LLC. The paperwork made it look like a routine corporate restructuring, the kind of thing companies do all the time for tax or liability purposes. But when I looked at the ownership structure of Hughes Holdings LLC, I found that it was not owned by my grandfather or his estate. It was owned personally by Robert Hughes and James Hughes. They had stolen $3 million in real estate by making it look like a legitimate business reorganization. They had even been clever enough to have Hughes Construction pay rent to Hughes Holdings LLC for using its own former properties. So not only had they stolen the real estate, they were now extracting ongoing rental payments from the company. It was audacious and evil, and so well disguised that if I had not been specifically looking for fraud, I might have missed it entirely. There were smaller thefts, too. An expense account that Uncle Robert used to charge personal meals and travel to the company. Consulting fees paid to his law firm for work that was never actually performed. Restructuring costs that went into vaguely defined accounts and then disappeared. Individually, these were small amounts, $5,000 here, $10,000 there. But they added up to hundreds of thousands of dollars over 6 months. I created a spreadsheet documenting everything I found. I color-coded different types of fraud: red for direct asset theft, orange for inflated vendor contracts, yellow for fake consulting fees, blue for real estate transfers. By the time I finished, my spreadsheet looked like a rainbow of criminal activity. The total amount stolen or siphoned off in just 6 months was approximately $2.4 million. If Uncle Robert had been allowed to continue for another year, there would have been nothing left of Hughes Construction except debt and empty buildings. And they had done it using power of attorney documents that appeared to have Grandpa's signature. I knew my grandfather's signature. I had seen it thousands of times on birthday cards and checks and school permission slips over the years. The signatures on these documents did not look right. They were similar, but not identical. The loops were different. The pressure was different. They looked like someone had traced his signature or forged it outright. I took photos of everything. I organized it all into folders on my laptop, and then I did what I probably should have done weeks earlier. I took it all to Attorney Margaret Sullivan, the lawyer who had helped Grandpa set up his estate planning. Attorney Sullivan looked through the documents I had brought, her expression growing increasingly grim. When she finished, She looked at me over her reading glasses. "Christopher, this is fraud, possibly elder abuse. These documents purport to show your grandfather authorizing major business transactions and asset transfers. But according to my records, your grandfather has not been mentally competent to authorize such transactions for at least 6 months. The facility's doctors have documented his cognitive decline. There is no way he could have understood, let alone approved, these complex financial arrangements. The signatures look forged, too. I agree. We would need a handwriting expert to confirm it, but these do not look like the signatures I witnessed on his estate documents." She tapped the papers. "But here's the problem, Christopher. I am your grandfather's attorney, but my authority is limited. I can advise your mother and Aunt Linda as co-agents under the power of attorney, but I cannot bring legal action without their authorization and cooperation. Does your mother know about this?" I showed her some of it, but I do not think she fully understands what it means, and she does not want to believe her brothers would steal from their own father. That is common in these situations. Family members often have difficulty accepting that their siblings are capable of financial exploitation, but the evidence here is pretty clear. Your uncles have been systematically looting your grandfather's business while he is incapacitated and unable to stop them. What do we do? We need your mother and Aunt Linda to authorize a full forensic audit and to consider legal action against Robert and James. We should also report this to Adult Protective Services as potential elder abuse. And frankly, we should consider whether criminal charges are appropriate. Criminal charges against my own uncles? Christopher, they have stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars, possibly millions, from an incapacitated elderly man. That is not a family squabble. That is a crime. I went to my mother with Attorney Sullivan's assessment, and this time I did not soften the language. I told her directly that her brothers were thieves, that they had forged documents and stolen Grandpa's assets, that they needed to be stopped and prosecuted. My mother broke down crying. "They are my brothers. We grew up together. We were supposed to take care of each other, take care of Dad together. How could they do this? I do not know, Mom, but we have to act. If we do not, there will be nothing left of Grandpa's company. Everything he built will be gone. What can we even do? Robert is a lawyer. James is an accountant. They know how to hide this kind of thing. We are just a teacher and a college kid. How are we supposed to fight them?" And that was the question that haunted me. How was a 20-year-old business major supposed to take on 2 experienced professionals who had the money and expertise to hide their crimes? I went back to school for the spring semester feeling helpless and furious, watching from 200 miles away as my uncles continued to strip away Grandpa's legacy. But then I remembered something my business law professor, Professor Linda Martinez, had said during a lecture on fraud. The best evidence is often documentation created by the perpetrators themselves. Criminals, especially white-collar criminals, tend to be overconfident. They document their crimes because they do not think they will get caught, or because they need records for their own purposes. Your job is to find those records. I realized I needed more evidence. I needed documentation in my uncle's own words showing what they were doing. I needed them to incriminate themselves. So I started recording everything. I came home every weekend that semester, telling my family it was to help my mother with Grandpa's care. And I did help with that. But I also attended every meeting where Uncle Robert was present. I installed a recording app on my phone, and I recorded every conversation, every discussion about the business. Every time Uncle Robert talked about changes he was making or decisions he was implementing. In my state, it was legal to record conversations as long as one party consented, and I was that party. My uncles had no idea I was documenting everything they said. Over the course of 3 months, I collected dozens of hours of recordings. I became skilled at positioning my phone casually on tables, at keeping it in my shirt pocket with the microphone pointing outward, at finding excuses to be present at family gatherings where my uncles would talk business. I captured Uncle Robert and Uncle James discussing how to structure asset transfers to avoid scrutiny. I recorded Uncle Robert explaining to Uncle James how they could use their father's deteriorating mental state to justify decisions he would never have approved. One recording from early February was particularly damning. I had come home for the weekend, ostensibly to help my mother with some tasks around her house. Uncle Robert and Uncle James had stopped by for what they called a family business meeting to discuss Grandpa's care costs and the financial implications for the estate. I sat quietly in the corner of the living room, my phone recording in my jacket pocket, while my uncles talked. The facility costs are eating into the estate faster than we anticipated, Uncle Robert said, reviewing some papers. At $8,000 a month, that is nearly $100,000 a year. If Dad lives another 3 or 4 years, we are talking about $300,000 to $400,000 just for his care. That is a lot of money, my mother said, her voice worried. But he needs that level of care. The memory unit is the best facility in the region. Of course, Uncle Robert said smoothly. Nobody is suggesting we do not provide Dad with excellent care, but we need to be realistic about the financial implications, which is why James and I have been working on restructuring the company assets to ensure there is sufficient liquidity to cover these ongoing costs. What kind of restructuring? Aunt Linda asked. She had been quiet until then, but something in Uncle Robert's tone had alerted her. Just routine corporate reorganization, separating personal real estate from business operations, establishing clearer liability protection, that sort of thing. Standard business practice for a company this size. Should we not discuss this with Dad? Aunt Linda pressed, or at least with his lawyer? Dad is not competent to make these decisions anymore, Uncle Robert said, his voice taking on a sharp edge. That is the entire point of having power of attorney. Linda, you and Rachel have healthcare power of attorney. James and I are handling the business and financial side. We are all doing our part to protect Dad and his legacy. But Mom said you were specifically excluded from the power of attorney, I said, speaking up for the first time. Grandpa chose Mom and Aunt Linda to be his agents. Uncle Robert's eyes fixed on me with cold anger. Christopher, the adults are talking. This is complicated legal and financial territory that you do not understand. I understand that Grandpa did not want you making decisions about his business. What your grandfather wanted and what is actually necessary are two different things. He made those estate planning decisions before his condition deteriorated, before we understood how quickly the disease would progress and how expensive his care would be. Circumstances have changed, and we need to adapt. By transferring his assets into companies you own. The room went dead silent. My mother looked at me sharply. Christopher, what are you talking about? Hughes Holdings LLC, I said, meeting Uncle Robert's gaze. The company that now owns Grandpa's real estate. The company that Robert and James own, not Grandpa. Uncle James looked like he wanted to disappear into his chair. Uncle Robert's face had gone red. That is a protective corporate structure recommended by our legal counsel. It shields the real estate from potential business liabilities. If something goes wrong with a construction project, if there is a lawsuit, we do not want personal real estate exposed to those claims. That would make sense if Grandpa still owned the LLC, but he does not. You and Uncle James do. You transferred Grandpa's property into a company you own. That is not asset protection. That is theft. How dare you? Uncle Robert said, standing up. I have spent months trying to protect this family's interests, working with attorneys and accountants to ensure everything is handled properly, And you, a 19-year-old kid who has taken maybe 2 business classes, you dare to accuse me of theft? I am just reading the documents. The LLC operating agreement lists you and Uncle James as the members. Not Grandpa, not his estate, you. My mother picked up the papers Uncle Robert had been showing her, reading them more carefully now. Robert, is this true? Does Dad own this company, or do you? It is complicated, Rachel. The ownership structure is designed to... It is a simple question. Who owns Hughes Holdings LLC? Uncle Robert and Uncle James exchanged a look. Finally, Uncle James spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. Technically, Robert and I are listed as the members, but it is for Dad's benefit, to protect his assets. By taking them away from him, Aunt Linda said, her voice rising, by putting them in your names? We did not take anything, Uncle Robert snapped. We restructured for legitimate business purposes. Using forged power of attorney documents, I said. They are not forged. Dad signed them. Grandpa has not been capable of signing legal documents in 6 months. His doctors have documented his cognitive decline. So either those signatures are forgeries, or you got a man with dementia to sign papers he did not understand, which is elder abuse. Uncle Robert took a step toward me, and I thought for a moment he might actually hit me. But my mother stood up and moved between us. I think you two need to leave, she said, her voice shaking but firm. And I think we need to have our own attorney review everything you have been doing with Dad's company. You are making a huge mistake, Rachel, Uncle Robert said. You are letting a kid who knows nothing about business turn you against your own brothers. We have been trying to help. We have been trying to save the company and ensure there is something left for all of us. But if you want to side with Christopher and his accusations, if you want to blow up this family over paranoid conspiracy theories, then fine. Be prepared for the consequences. They left, slamming the door hard enough to make the windows rattle. My mother sank back into her chair, tears streaming down her face. Christopher, tell me you are wrong. Please tell me my brothers have not been stealing from their dying father. I wish I could, Mom, but I have the documents, and now I have them admitting it on tape. I pulled out my phone and played back the recording of the conversation we had just had, Uncle Robert's voice clear and incriminating as he explained the restructuring and grew defensive when challenged. My mother listened with her hand over her mouth, the reality of what her brothers had done finally sinking in. But that was not the most damning recording I would capture. That came 2 weeks later, when I caught Uncle Robert and Uncle James discussing their endgame in what they thought was a private conversation. I had driven home midweek, telling my professors I had a family emergency that required me to miss a few days of class. I parked down the street from Uncle Robert's house and waited. I knew he and Uncle James met there every Wednesday evening to strategize, and I wanted to hear what they said when they thought no family members were listening. Getting the recording required some creative trespassing. Uncle Robert's home office had a window that faced the backyard, and I was able to position myself outside that window hidden by some landscaping. It was risky and probably illegal, but I needed this evidence. I needed them to admit, in their own words, what they were really doing. Their conversations started with discussion of the confrontation from 2 weeks earlier, with Uncle Robert angry about being challenged and Uncle James nervous about the scrutiny. We need to accelerate the timeline, Uncle Robert said. Christopher is becoming a problem. That little punk thinks he can play detective, thinks he can stop us. Maybe we should slow down, Uncle James said, his voice uncertain. If Rachel is getting suspicious, if she brings in attorneys, she cannot afford attorneys. She is barely affording Dad's care. And even if she could, by the time any lawyer figures out what we have done, we will have transferred everything out. The old man will probably be dead within a year or two anyway, and by then, all the valuable assets will be in our LLC. Linda and Rachel can have the husk of Hughes Construction, all the liabilities and overhead with none of the real value. They will never know what hit them. What about Christopher? He seems to know more than he should. He is a kid. He does not understand business. Let him ask questions. By the time anyone figures out what we have done, it will be too late to reverse it. And even if they try to sue, we will tie them up in court for years. Linda cannot afford a protracted legal battle. She will have to accept a settlement that leaves us with most of the value. We just need to keep moving quickly, finish the asset transfers, and then wait out the clock. I still feel bad about this, Robert. Dad built that company. It should go to his kids, not. Dad is gone, James. The man who built that company does not exist anymore. There is just a shell in a nursing home who does not even remember he had a business. And we are the ones with the expertise to manage these assets properly. Linda and Rachel, they are a teacher and a nurse. What do they know about running a multi-million-dollar construction company? We are actually doing everyone a favor by taking control before they run it into the ground. Do you really believe that? I believe that we have worked hard our entire lives and we deserve this. I believe that Dad would want his sons to be provided for, and I believe that we are smart enough to take what should have been ours in the first place. I recorded 20 minutes of that conversation, my hand trembling as I held my phone up toward the window. When they finally finished their meeting and Uncle James left, I crept back to my car and sat there in the darkness, listening to the recording over and over. This was it. This was the evidence that would destroy them. In their own words, they had confessed to everything. The theft, the strategy, the plan to wait out my grandfather's death while stripping his company bare. Listening to my uncles casually discuss stealing from their dying father and dismissing me as too young and stupid to stop them filled me with a rage I had never felt before. But it also filled me with determination, because they were right that I was young and inexperienced. But they were catastrophically wrong that I was incapable. They had underestimated me, and that would be their downfall. I took all my recordings, all my documents, all my evidence to Attorney Sullivan. I have them. I have everything we need to prove what they have been doing. She listened to the recordings, her expression shifting from concern to something like grim satisfaction. Christopher, this is excellent work. This is exactly the kind of evidence we need. With these admissions, we can go to court and freeze their assets, reverse the fraudulent transfers, and potentially have them charged criminally. What do I need to do? First, we need your mother and Aunt Linda to sign off on legal action. Then we need to hire a forensic accountant to document the full extent of the theft. And we need to file for emergency injunctive relief to prevent your uncles from disposing of any more assets while we build the case. How much is all that going to cost? Attorney Sullivan looked at me with sympathy. Tens of thousands of dollars, potentially hundreds of thousands if your uncles fight back hard. This kind of litigation is expensive, Christopher, and your mother is already struggling to pay for your grandfather's care. I thought about my college fund, money my grandfather had set aside for my education. It was about $30,000, enough to pay for most of my remaining 2 years of school if I was careful. But it was also potentially the seed money we needed to save Grandpa's legacy. Use my college fund, I said. Use whatever you need. Christopher, that is your education, your future. My grandfather built that company, so his family would have a future. If I let my uncles steal it, then what was the point of any of it? I would rather drop out of college and fight than stand by and do nothing. Attorney Sullivan studied me for a long moment. You remind me of your grandfather. You have his sense of right and wrong, his willingness to fight for what matters. Okay, If your mother and Anne agree, we will use your education fund to start the legal process. But Christopher, I want you to understand something. This is going to get ugly. Your family will never be the same after this. Your uncles will hate you. Other relatives will take sides. You are going to lose relationships you have had your entire life. Are you prepared for that? I thought about my grandfather, sitting in a memory care facility, his mind slowly disappearing, unaware that his own sons were dismantling everything he had built. I thought about the decades of work he had put into Hughes Construction, the employees who depended on the company for their livelihoods, the legacy that should have been protected. I am prepared for whatever it takes. The legal process moved faster than I expected. Attorney Sullivan filed an emergency petition for injunctive relief, arguing that Robert and James Hughes had engaged in fraud and were actively dissipating the assets of an incapacitated person's estate. She submitted the recordings as evidence, along with the forged documents, the financial analysis showing the systematic asset transfers, and expert testimony about Grandpa's mental state. The judge granted a temporary restraining order, freezing all of my uncle's transactions related to Hughes Construction assets. He ordered them to appear in court within 2 weeks to show cause why a permanent injunction should not be issued. Uncle Robert was blindsided. He had not known about the recordings, had not expected that anyone would actually challenge what he had been doing. He immediately hired a powerful law firm, some of the best litigators in the state, to fight the injunction. And that was when things got truly ugly. The family split down the middle. Uncle James, realizing he was facing potential criminal charges, hired his own lawyer and started trying to cut a deal, claiming Uncle Robert had manipulated him, that he had not understood what they were doing was illegal. Uncle Robert was furious at this betrayal, and the two brothers, who had been co-conspirators, turned on each other. Aunt Linda stood with my mother and me, appalled by what her brothers had done. But other relatives, cousins and aunts and uncles on the periphery of the immediate family took Uncle Robert's side, arguing that we were tearing the family apart over money, that we should forgive and move on, that airing our dirty laundry in court was shameful. There was a family gathering at my grandmother's house, my mother's mother, who was still alive and sharp as a tack at 82. She called everyone together to try to mediate, to find a solution that would avoid a public court battle. Uncle Robert came with his expensive lawyer, Uncle James came with his lawyer, and my mother came with Attorney Sullivan and me. "This has gone too far," my grandmother said, her voice shaking with age and emotion. "You are family. You do not sue each other. You do not destroy each other like this." "Mom, they stole from Dad," my mother said. "They forged his signature and stole his company while he is dying in a nursing home. How can we just ignore that?" "We did not steal anything," Uncle Robert said. "We restructured assets to protect them from liability and ensure the business remains viable. Everything we did was legal and in Dad's best interest." "Then why did you forge his signature?" I asked. "If everything was legal, why not get proper authorization?" "We had authorization through the power of attorney." "You had authorization through a power of attorney that Grandpa specifically revoked and replaced with new designations that excluded you. You knew you did not have legal authority, so you faked his signature." Uncle Robert's lawyer, a sharp-faced woman in an expensive suit, leaned forward. "Christopher, is it? You are, 20 years old, a sophomore in college, and you think you understand complex business and legal transactions better than experienced professionals." "I understand fraud when I see it, and I have recordings of my uncles admitting to exactly what they did and why. Recordings obtained without proper consent, which may not be admissible in court. Single-party consent is legal in this state. I was part of every conversation I recorded. They are fully admissible." The lawyer's expression tightened. She had not expected me to know the law. Nobody had expected the college kid to actually know what he was doing. Even if the recordings are admissible, she continued, they show at most a good faith disagreement about business strategy. My client believed he was acting in his father's best interest to preserve and protect company assets. There was no criminal intent. There was criminal intent when he forged signatures. There was criminal intent when he transferred assets to an LLC he owns. There was criminal intent when he said, and I quote, "By the time anyone figures out what we have done, it will be too late to reverse it." I pulled out my phone and played that specific recording for everyone in the room. Uncle Robert's voice, cold and calculating, talking about stealing from his dying father and getting away with it. The room went silent. My grandmother's face crumpled. Aunt Linda started crying. Even Uncle Robert's lawyer looked uncomfortable. "You have been recording us," Uncle Robert said, his voice low and dangerous. "You little shit, you have been sneaking around, spying on your own family." "I was documenting crimes. You have no idea what you have done. You have destroyed this family. You have humiliated me, jeopardized my career, my reputation. And for what? To play hero? To impress your grandfather, who cannot even remember your name anymore. I did it to protect what he built, something you should have done instead of trying to steal it." Uncle Robert stood up, his face red with fury. "You want a war, Christopher? You want to take this to court? Fine. I will bury you. I will bury your mother. I will drag this out for years, cost you every penny you have, and in the end I will still win, because that is what people like me do. We win. And people like you, naive college kids who think they can change the world, you lose. Then I guess we will see in court." The mediation failed. The family gathering dissolved into shouting and accusations and threats. My grandmother was in tears, begging us to stop, to find a way to reconcile. But there was no reconciliation possible, not after what had been revealed, not after the recordings had been played. The family was broken, and I was the one who had broken it. The court battle that followed lasted 8 months. It was 8 months of depositions and discovery, of forensic accountants going through every transaction, of handwriting experts confirming that the signatures on key documents were forgeries. It was 8 months of my mother crying herself to sleep, of missing classes because I had to testify or attend hearings, of watching my college fund, and then my mother's savings, and then money borrowed from friends, get consumed by legal fees that seemed to multiply exponentially every week. The first major hearing was for the preliminary injunction. This was where we had to convince the judge that Uncle Robert and Uncle James were actively harming my grandfather's estate and needed to be stopped immediately before they could dispose of more assets. It was held in a wood-paneled courtroom that smelled of old books and floor polish, with Judge Patricia Hawkins presiding from an elevated bench that made her look severe and imposing. Attorney Sullivan presented our case methodically. She submitted the forged documents, showing how the signatures did not match my grandfather's known signature patterns. She presented the financial analysis, showing the systematic transfer of assets out of Hughes Construction. She played excerpts from the recordings, my uncle's voices echoing through the courtroom as they discussed their plan to steal from their dying father. I watched Uncle Robert's face as his own words were played for the judge. He sat at the defense table in an expensive suit, his lawyer whispering in his ear, and his expression was a mixture of fury and calculation. He was trying to figure out how to spin this, how to make it sound less damning than it clearly was. His lawyer, a woman named Patricia Thornton, who had a reputation as one of the most aggressive litigators in the state, stood up when it was their turn to respond. She was in her 50s, with sharp features and an even sharper suit, and she spoke with the kind of confidence that came from winning a lot of expensive cases. "Your Honor, what we have here is a family tragedy being exploited by a young man who does not understand the complexities of estate management," she began. "William Hughes is suffering from Alzheimer's disease. His son, Robert Hughes, an experienced attorney, has been working tirelessly to protect his father's assets and ensure the viability of the family business. The so-called forged signatures were documents signed by Mr. Hughes Sr. when he still had testamentary capacity, before his condition deteriorated. The asset transfers were legitimate corporate restructuring recommended by financial advisors to protect the estate from potential liability. Then why do the signatures not match?" Judge Hawkins asked, looking over her glasses at the attorney. "Alzheimer's disease can affect fine motor control, Your Honor. As the disease progresses, handwriting naturally changes. An expert comparing a signature from someone in the early stages of dementia to their pre-diagnosis signature would naturally find inconsistencies." It was a good argument. It was exactly the kind of plausible explanation that made these cases so difficult to prosecute. Attorney Sullivan stood up for rebuttal. "Your Honor, may I direct the court's attention to Exhibit 17? This is a medical evaluation from Dr. Sandra Whitmore, the neurologist treating Mr. William Hughes. She states unequivocally that as of June of last year, Mr. Hughes was no longer capable of understanding complex financial documents or making informed decisions about asset transfers. The documents in question are dated August, September, and October, 2 to 4 months after Dr. Whitmore determined he lacked capacity. Unless Mr. Thornton is suggesting that Alzheimer's spontaneously reversed itself for a few months, these signatures could not have been made by a competent William Hughes." "What about the recordings?" Judge Hawkins asked. "Ms. Thornton, how do you explain your client's statements about waiting for his father to die so he could keep the assets?" "Taken out of context, Your Honor, my client and his brother were having a private conversation about estate planning scenarios. They were discussing hypothetical outcomes, not admitting to criminal activity. It is unfortunate that this conversation was recorded without their knowledge or consent. It is legal in this state to record conversations with single-party consent," Attorney Sullivan countered. "Christopher Hughes was present during some of these conversations and recorded them legally. And the conversation in question was not hypothetical. Mr. Robert Hughes specifically stated that he planned to have the valuable assets in his LLC and leave his sisters with the company's liabilities. That is not estate planning. That is theft." The hearing lasted 4 hours, with both sides presenting witnesses and evidence. Uncle Robert testified, smooth and confident, explaining that everything he had done was to protect the family business during a difficult time. He claimed my grandfather had asked him to help with the restructuring before the dementia got too bad, that the signatures were genuine, that the asset transfers were all above board. Then it was my turn to testify. I sat in the witness box, my mouth dry, my heart pounding, aware that Uncle Robert was staring at me with undisguised hatred. Attorney Sullivan walked me through my evidence, asking me to explain how I had discovered the fraud, what the documents showed, why I believed my uncles were stealing. Then Patricia Thornton stood up for cross-examination, and I understood why she was paid so much money. She was devastating. "Mr. Hughes, you are 20 years old. Is that correct?" "Yes." "And you are a college sophomore studying business?" "Yes." "How many years of experience do you have in corporate law?" "None, but..." "How many years of experience do you have in estate planning?" "None." "How many years of experience do you have in managing a multi-million-dollar construction company?" "I do not have experience managing it, but I have worked." "Please just answer the question, Mr. Hughes. Do you have experience managing a multi-million-dollar company?" "No." "So what qualifies you to determine that experienced professionals like your uncles men with decades of business and legal experience, were doing something wrong. I can read financial documents. I can see when money is being transferred out of a company into private accounts. Can you? You have taken, 2 or 3 business classes at this point in your college career? 4 classes, and I had business law with Professor Martinez, who taught us specifically about 4 classes. That is your qualification for undergraduate classes, and based on this extensive education, you have accused your uncle, a successful attorney, of being a criminal. I accused him based on the evidence. The forged signatures, the asset transfers, his own recorded words. Recordings you made by sneaking around, hiding your phone, essentially spying on your family. I was documenting crimes. Or you were a young man angry that his uncles were making decisions he did not agree with, so you decided to create a narrative of wrongdoing where none existed. Is not it true, Mr. Hughes, that you have always been very close to your grandfather? Yes. And is not it true that you were upset when your Uncle Robert was initially going to be appointed as conservator before your mother intervened? I was concerned about. Is not it possible that this entire crusade of yours is motivated not by actual wrongdoing, but by a personal vendetta against your Uncle Robert? That you cannot accept that adults with more experience than you are making decisions about your grandfather's care and assets? No, that is not true. I am doing this because my uncles are stealing, or because you are a young man who thinks he knows better than everyone else, who recorded private family conversations and twisted them to support a preconceived narrative. No further questions, Your Honor. I left the witness stand feeling shaken. Thornton had made me sound naive, vindictive, out of my depth. She had planted seeds of doubt about my motives and my competence. Looking at Judge Hawkins's face, I could not tell if she believed me or if she thought I was just an overconfident kid playing detective. But then Attorney Sullivan called her expert witness, Dr. Ellen Rodriguez, a forensic document examiner who had spent 30 years analyzing handwriting for criminal and civil cases. Dr. Rodriguez had examined the signatures on the asset transfer documents and compared them to known signatures from my grandfather. She presented her findings with calm, professional authority. She showed enlargements of the signatures, pointing out specific inconsistencies. The pressure patterns are wrong, she explained. William Hughes's authentic signatures show consistent pressure throughout the stroke, indicating a confident, practiced hand. The signatures on these documents show variable pressure and hesitation marks, suggesting someone was carefully tracing or copying. Additionally, the letter formations do not match Mr. Hughes's natural style. The capital H here, for example, has a different loop structure than any of his known authentic signatures. In your professional opinion, Dr. Rodriguez, are these signatures genuine? No. I would testify with a high degree of certainty that these signatures were not written by William Hughes. They are sophisticated forgeries, but forgeries nonetheless. Uncle Robert's team tried to challenge Dr. Rodriguez's credentials and methodology, but she was unshakable. She had done this for 3 decades. She knew her science, and her testimony was damning. Judge Hawkins granted the preliminary injunction. She froze all of Uncle Robert and Uncle James's transactions related to Hughes construction assets. She ordered them to show cause within 2 weeks, why a permanent injunction should not be issued, and why they should not face sanctions for their conduct. It was not a full victory, not yet, but it was a start. Uncle Robert was blindsided. He had not expected that a judge would take a college kid's accusations seriously. He had not expected Dr. Rodriguez's testimony to be so convincing, and he had certainly not expected to lose the preliminary hearing. He immediately escalated his legal response, bringing in more attorneys, filing countersuits against my mother and me for defamation and malicious prosecution, trying to bury us under an avalanche of legal paperwork and motions. The discovery phase was brutal. Both sides demanded documents, took depositions, subpoenaed records. I sat for 2 full days of deposition, with Uncle Robert's lawyers asking me the same questions over and over in slightly different ways, trying to catch me in inconsistencies or admissions. They asked about my relationship with my grandfather, my finances, my grades in school, my political beliefs, anything they could use to paint me as unreliable or motivated by something other than truth. They deposed my mother, reducing her to tears as they questioned whether she was a fit power of attorney, whether she had properly understood her father's wishes, whether she had been manipulated by her son. They deposed Aunt Linda, trying to create divisions between her and my mother, suggesting that she should side with her brothers instead of her sisters. The forensic accountant we hired, a man named David Chun, who specialized in fraud cases, spent weeks going through every transaction Hughes Construction had made in the past 2 years. His final report was 147 pages long and documented the systematic extraction of value from the company. He calculated that Uncle Robert and Uncle James had taken or redirected $2.4 million in value over 9 months, and that if they had been allowed to continue, the company would have been essentially worthless within another year. David testified at the main trial, walking the judge through his analysis transaction by transaction. He showed how vendor contracts had been switched to more expensive suppliers, how equipment had been sold below value, how real estate had been transferred to the LLC. He showed how Uncle Robert had charged Grandpa's company for legal services that were never actually performed, how Uncle James had redirected funds into accounts they controlled, how together they had created a systematic scheme to loot the business. Uncle Robert's team brought in their own forensic accountant, who tried to argue that all of these transactions had legitimate business justifications, that the vendor changes were strategic pivots, that the equipment sales were prudent asset management, that the real estate transfer was proper liability protection. But under cross-examination by Attorney Sullivan, their expert admitted he had not looked at the ownership structure of the vendors or the LLC, had not traced where the money actually went, had not considered whether there might be conflicts of interest. The trial reached its climax when Uncle James took the stand. Unlike Uncle Robert, who was still fighting aggressively and denying everything, Uncle James had begun to crack under the pressure. His lawyer had advised him to cooperate, to try to get a plea deal, to save himself before Uncle Robert dragged him down completely. Attorney Sullivan questioned him gently at first, establishing his role in the family business, his accounting credentials, his relationship with his father. Then she moved in for the critical questions. Mr. Hughes, you signed off on the asset transfers to Hughes Holdings LLC, correct? Yes, I did. And at the time you signed those documents, did you believe William Hughes had given informed consent for those transfers? Uncle James was silent for a long moment, his face pale and sweating. His lawyer had probably coached him to say yes, to maintain that everything was legitimate. But sitting in that courtroom, with his father's fate hanging in the balance, with the weight of his actions pressing down on him, he could not do it. No, he said quietly. I did not think Dad understood what was happening. His dementia was too advanced. The courtroom erupted. Uncle Robert's face went white with fury. His lawyers immediately called for a recess, huddling with Uncle Robert in urgent whispered conversation. They had just lost the case, and they knew it. Mr. Hughes, Attorney Sullivan continued when order was restored, whose idea was it to transfer the assets to an LLC that you and your brother owned? Robert's idea. He said we needed to protect the valuable assets, that Rachel and Linda were not competent to manage them, that Dad would want us to ensure the wealth stayed in the family. By taking it for yourselves? Robert said it was for everyone's benefit, that we would manage the assets properly and then distribute everything fairly when Dad passed. But I think I always knew that was not really the plan. Robert wanted control. He wanted to be the one who decided how everything was divided. And he convinced me that we deserved more because we had the expertise, the business knowledge. He made it sound reasonable. Did you know the signatures on the transfer documents were forged? Another long silence. Then, barely audible. Yes. Uncle Robert stood up, shouting that Uncle James was lying, that he had lost his nerve and was trying to save himself by throwing his brother under the bus. The judge threatened to hold him in contempt if he did not sit down and be quiet. Uncle James sat in the witness box with his head down, looking like he wanted to disappear, while his testimony destroyed what little defense they had left. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s named Judge Patricia Hawkins, listened to everything with an expression that gave away nothing. At the end of the trial, she took 2 weeks to issue her ruling. I will never forget standing in that courtroom when Judge Hawkins read her decision 2 weeks later, after reviewing all the testimony and evidence. My mother gripping my hand so tightly her nails left marks. Attorney Sullivan, standing tall and confident beside us, though I could see the tension in her shoulders. Uncle Robert and his lawyers on the other side of the courtroom. Uncle Robert's face a mask of barely controlled fury. Uncle James sitting separately now with his own lawyer, having completely split from his brother in hopes of a more lenient outcome. Judge Hawkins looked over her reading glasses at my uncles, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of absolute moral authority. I have reviewed the evidence presented in this case thoroughly, and I find it not only compelling but deeply disturbing, she began. The recordings submitted by the plaintiff clearly show that Robert Hughes and James Hughes engaged in a calculated, premeditated effort to steal assets from their incapacitated father. This was not a misunderstanding about business practices. This was not a good faith disagreement about estate planning. This was theft, pure and simple, made all the more reprehensible by the fact that the victim was their own father, a man who could not defend himself against their actions due to cognitive decline. She went through the evidence point by point. The forged signatures, which Dr. Rodriguez had conclusively shown were not my grandfather's. The asset transfers that served no legitimate business purpose except to enrich the defendants. The vendor contracts that directed business to companies connected to Uncle Robert in exchange for kickbacks. The systematic extraction of value from a company built over 40 years of honest work. Mr. Robert Hughes and Mr. James Hughes abused their positions as family members to gain access to business documents and financial records. Judge Hawkins continued. They exploited their father's trust and their mother's and sister's lack of business expertise. They forged signatures to create false authorization. They transferred millions of dollars in assets to entities they controlled. And when confronted with evidence of their wrongdoing, Mr. Robert Hughes responded not with remorse but with aggression, attempting to intimidate and silence those who dared to question his actions. She looked directly at Uncle Robert. "Sir, you are an attorney. You took an oath to uphold the law and to act with integrity. Instead, you used your legal knowledge to construct a sophisticated scheme to defraud your own father. You preyed on a vulnerable elderly man with dementia. There is no defense for such conduct, and there will be consequences." Judge Hawkins ordered all transferred assets to be returned to Hughes Construction immediately. She ordered Robert and James to pay restitution for any assets that could not be returned in their original form, plus interest calculated from the date of transfer. She ordered them to pay my mother's legal fees, which had topped $150,000 and had nearly bankrupted our family. She ordered them to pay additional sanctions of $50,000 each for their fraudulent conduct and abuse of the legal process. Most significantly, she referred the case to the State Attorney General's office for potential criminal prosecution of elder abuse, fraud, forgery, and theft. She stated for the record that, in her opinion, the evidence supported criminal charges, and she hoped the state would pursue justice not just through civil remedies, but through the criminal justice system. We had won, against all odds, against expensive lawyers and experienced opponents who had tried to intimidate and exhaust us, against a system that often favors those with money and expertise over those who are young and inexperienced. We had won. My mother collapsed into her chair, sobbing with relief and exhaustion. She had carried the weight of this battle for 8 months, while also managing her father's deteriorating health and her full-time job and her worry about her children. Now, finally, it was over. The assets would be returned. The company would be saved. Her father's legacy would be protected. Attorney Sullivan allowed herself a small, professional smile and shook my hand. "You did it, Christopher. You saved your grandfather's company. You should be very proud." I just felt numb, drained of all emotion. The adrenaline that had sustained me through months of depositions and hearings and testimony evaporated all at once, leaving me hollow. I had won the battle, but the cost was written all over the courtroom. My family, which had once gathered for holidays and birthdays and Sunday dinners, was shattered beyond repair. Uncle Robert stood up, and for a moment I thought he was going to say something, to threaten or plead, or try one more manipulation. But he just looked at me with absolute, undiluted hatred. It was a look that said, "I will never forgive you for this. You have destroyed me, destroyed my career, destroyed my reputation, and I will hate you until the day I die." Then he turned and walked out of the courtroom, his lawyers scrambling to follow. That was the last time I ever saw him in person. Uncle James remained behind, crying quietly. He approached my mother and tried to apologize, tried to explain that he had been manipulated by Robert, that he had never wanted things to go this far. My mother looked at him with an expression of profound sadness and simply said, "You stole from our father, James. You watched him lose his mind and you stole from him. I do not think I can ever forgive that." Aunt Linda would not even look at him. He left the courtroom alone, a broken man who had sacrificed his integrity and his family for money he would never get to enjoy. The aftermath was complicated and painful in ways I had not fully anticipated. The judge's ruling meant the assets would be returned, but the damage to the company during those 9 months of looting was significant. Danny Morrison, the longtime foreman, had left and taken his expertise with him. Several other key employees had followed, no longer trusting that Hughes Construction was the company they had signed up to work for. Client relationships had been damaged by canceled contracts and inconsistent management. The company's reputation, so carefully built over 4 decades, had been tarnished by the family drama and legal battles that had played out in the courts and in local newspapers. My mother and Aunt Linda worked with the remaining management team to stabilize operations and rebuild. They brought in a professional CEO, someone with construction industry experience and no connection to our family, to run day-to-day operations. They reached out to former employees like Danny Morrison, trying to convince them to return. They met with clients to repair relationships and assure them that Hughes Construction was back on solid footing. It was hard work, made harder by the fact that both of them were grieving the loss of their brothers and managing their father's final decline. Because my grandfather, through all of this, continued to fade away. He had no idea that a legal battle had been fought over his legacy. He did not know that his sons had tried to steal from him or that his grandson had saved his company. By the time the trial ended, he could no longer recognize any of us. He would smile politely when we visited, like we were friendly strangers rather than his children and grandchildren. He would sometimes talk about his company as if he still ran it, giving instructions for projects that had been completed decades ago, worrying about employees who had long since retired or died. He passed away 8 months after the trial ended, in his sleep, in the memory care facility that had been his home for his final 2 years. His mind had gone long before his body failed. Alzheimer's had taken everything from him. His memories, his identity, his awareness of the family drama that had consumed his final years. In some ways, that was a mercy. He never had to know that his own sons had betrayed him. The funeral was surreal. My mother and Aunt Linda organized it, a service at the church where Grandpa had been a member for 40 years. Employees from Hughes Construction attended, some who had worked with him for decades. Friends and business associates filled the pews, paying respect to a man who had been a pillar of the community. My sister Emma and I sat in the front row with our mother, accepting condolences from people who told us stories about Grandpa's integrity, his generosity, his craftsmanship. Uncle Robert did not attend. He sent no flowers, no card, no acknowledgement of his father's death. He had cut himself off completely from the family, living in what I heard was self-imposed exile in another state. His law license had been suspended pending the outcome of the criminal case. His reputation was destroyed. Mutual acquaintances told us he had become bitter and angry, blaming everyone but himself for the consequences of his actions. Uncle James came to the funeral, but sat in the back, alone, crying through the entire service. No one spoke to him. After the burial, he tried to approach my mother and Aunt Linda to express condolences, but Aunt Linda told him firmly that he was not welcome, that he had lost the right to grieve with the family when he chose to betray his father. He left without another word. I learned later that he had lost his accounting certification and had moved out of state as well, unable to face the shame of what he had done in the community where he had lived his entire life. The criminal case moved forward slowly. The state attorney general's office charged both Uncle Robert and Uncle James with elder abuse, fraud, forgery, and theft. Uncle James, following his lawyer's advice, immediately entered into a plea agreement. He pled guilty to reduced charges of elder abuse and fraud, receiving 3 years of probation, substantial fines, and a permanent prohibition from serving as a fiduciary or handling anyone else's financial affairs. He also agreed to cooperate fully with the prosecution of Uncle Robert. Uncle Robert fought the charges for another year, hiring even more expensive criminal defense lawyers, filing motions to suppress evidence, arguing that the recordings were inadmissible, that his brother's testimony was unreliable, that he had acted in good faith, but the evidence was overwhelming. The forensic document analysis, the financial records, the recordings, Uncle James's testimony, all of it painted a picture of a calculated criminal enterprise. Eventually, faced with the likelihood of a trial he could not win and a potential sentence of up to 10 years in prison, Uncle Robert accepted a plea deal as well. He pled guilty to felony elder abuse and fraud. He received a sentence of 5 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 3 years. His law license was permanently revoked. He was ordered to pay additional restitution and fines totaling nearly $200,000. And he was forever barred from having any contact with elderly or vulnerable persons in a fiduciary capacity. The family never recovered from the damage his crimes inflicted. Thanksgiving and Christmas gatherings, which had once brought together aunts, uncles, cousins, and grandparents, became impossible to organize. How do you sit around a table and pretend everything is normal when 2 family members are either in prison or on probation for stealing from their dead father? How do you celebrate family bonds when those bonds proved so fragile that they shattered under the weight of greed? Cousins who had been like siblings growing up no longer spoke to me. Some blamed me for destroying the family by pursuing legal action rather than trying to handle things privately. They thought I should have accepted that what was done, that family was more important than money, that I had been vindictive and cruel to put my own uncles in prison. Others sided with my mother and me, but felt awkward about how to maintain relationships when half the family was persona non grata. My grandmother died 2 years after my grandfather, and I will always believe the stress of seeing her children at war, seeing her family torn apart, contributed to her decline. She had pleaded with us to find a way to reconcile, to forgive, to move past what had happened. But my mother could not forgive men who had stolen from her dying father. I could not forgive uncles who had dismissed me as a stupid kid while they committed elder abuse. And so my grandmother died with a broken heart, mourning not just her husband, but the family that had disintegrated after his diagnosis. Uncle Robert did not attend her funeral either. We learned through third parties that he was bitter about being excluded from her will, that she had cut him out after learning about his crimes, leaving her modest estate to be divided among her daughters and grandchildren. Even in death, even from his own mother, Uncle Robert faced the consequences of his choices. But Hughes Construction survived. That is the important part of this story. The company my grandfather built with his bare hands, the company that represented 40 years of honest work and ethical business practices, survived the attempt to destroy it. My mother and Aunt Linda worked with professional management to rebuild operations, rehire talented employees, repair client relationships. It took years, and the company never quite regained the reputation and market position it had held during Grandpa's tenure, but it survived. I finished college, though it took me an extra year, because I had to work full-time to replace the education fund I had spent on legal fees. No scholarship or financial aid could cover what I had used to hire attorneys and forensic accountants, so I worked 2 jobs while taking classes, sleeping maybe 4 or 5 hours a night, determined to get my degree even though the path was so much harder than it should have been. I graduated with a degree in business, magna cum laude, despite the extended timeline, and I immediately went to work for Hughes Construction, not in management, not in some comfortable office position, but on job sites, learning the operations from the ground up, just like Grandpa had always wanted. I worked as an assistant project manager, then as a project manager, learning about permits and subcontractors and safety regulations and client relations. I learned to read blueprints, to estimate costs, to manage timelines, to handle the 1,000 small decisions that go into completing a construction project successfully. I am 24 now, managing several of the company's project teams and slowly building the expertise to eventually take over leadership when my mother and Aunt Linda are ready to step back. People in the industry sometimes ask me about the legal battle, about taking on my uncles in court when I was just 20 years old. I tell them the truth. It was the hardest thing I have ever done, and it cost more than I ever imagined. But it was also necessary. Because letting thieves steal from a vulnerable old man, even when those thieves are your own family, is not acceptable. Not to me. Not to the grandfather who taught me about integrity and hard work. I think about Uncle Robert sometimes, usually late at night, when I cannot sleep. I wonder if he is out of prison yet, if he ever found a way to rebuild his life after throwing away his career and his family for $2.4 million he ultimately did not get to keep. I wonder if he ever feels genuine remorse for what he did, or if he still believes he was somehow justified, somehow the victim in all of this. I wonder if he lies awake at night thinking about his father, about the man who came to America with nothing and built something remarkable, and whether he feels any shame for trying to steal that legacy. But mostly I think about the choice I made at 20 years old, to fight back even when everyone said I was too young, too inexperienced, too outmatched to win. I think about the recordings I made, the evidence I collected, the testimony I gave. I think about how being underestimated became my greatest advantage, because my uncles never saw me as a threat until it was too late. They dismissed me as just a kid playing detective, and that contempt blinded them to the fact that kids can be smart, determined, and resourceful. That education and integrity can sometimes triumph over experience and ruthlessness. I destroyed my family to save my grandfather's legacy. That is a complicated thing to live with. There are days I wonder if I did the right thing, if there was some other way to handle it that would not have burned down every relationship I had with half my relatives. There are nights I lie awake thinking about my grandmother crying at that failed mediation, or my cousins who will not return my calls, or the empty chairs at family gatherings where my uncles should have been. But then I drive past a school that Hughes Construction built, or a hospital wing we renovated, or one of the dozens of projects that bear my grandfather's fingerprints. I see the Hughes Construction trucks on job sites around the county, the company logo that represents decades of quality workmanship. I think about the 70-plus employees who still have jobs because the company survived. And I know that if I had done nothing, if I had looked away when I first saw those forged signatures, all of that would have been lost. The company would have been gutted and sold, the employees laid off, the legacy destroyed. All so two men who already had successful careers could have a little more money they did not need or deserve. My grandfather built something that lasted 40 years. I made sure it will last 40 more, 50 more, hopefully generations beyond that. The price was high. The family I knew growing up is gone, fractured beyond repair. Holidays are small and quiet now. Just my immediate family and Aunt Linda's family, a fraction of what they used to be. I carry guilt about that, about being the catalyst that broke everything apart. But I also carry pride. Pride that I stood up for what was right when it would have been easier to look away. Pride that I protected a vulnerable man who could not protect himself. Pride that I proved that being young does not mean being powerless. That a semester of business law and a smartphone can be more powerful than expensive lawyers if you have the courage to use them. If you have the determination to see justice done no matter the personal cost. My grandfather built something that lasted 40 years. I made sure it will last 40 more. That is my story, and it is the story of everyone who has ever had to grow up fast and make hard choices because the adults in their life failed to do what was right. Sometimes I am asked for advice by other young people who find themselves in similar situations, who discover that a parent or grandparent is being exploited, who feel powerless because of their age or lack of experience. I tell them what I learned, that documentation is everything, that truth matters more than relationships built on lies, that being young can actually be an advantage if you use it wisely. I tell them to trust their instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is wrong. Do not let people dismiss your concerns because you are young. Age does not grant wisdom, and experience does not guarantee integrity. Some of the most sophisticated frauds are committed by people with decades of professional credentials because they know exactly how to hide what they are doing. I tell them to keep records of everything, every suspicious transaction, every questionable decision, every conversation that raises red flags. Use technology. Your smartphone is more powerful than any detective tool available a generation ago. You can photograph documents, record conversations, save emails, create backup copies of everything in multiple cloud accounts where nobody can delete them. The evidence you collect today might be the difference between justice and theft tomorrow. I tell them to find allies. There are lawyers who specialize in elder law and will work pro bono or on contingency. There are organizations dedicated to fighting financial exploitation. There are social workers and adult protective services and forensic accountants who have seen these patterns before and know how to prove what is happening. You do not have to fight alone, and you should not try to. Find professionals who believe you and who have the expertise you lack. I tell them to be prepared for relationships to end. That is the hardest part, the part nobody warns you about. When you expose wrongdoing in your family, when you pursue justice against your own relatives, you will lose people you love. Some will side with the perpetrators out of loyalty or denial. Some will be angry that you disrupted the family equilibrium, even if that equilibrium was built on abuse. Some will choose the comfort of pretending nothing is wrong over the discomfort of acknowledging a terrible truth. Those losses are real and they hurt. I still have cousins I grew up with who will not speak to me. I still have relatives who think I destroyed our family for money, who do not understand or refuse to understand that I was protecting a vulnerable man from theft. I have missed weddings and graduations and family celebrations because my presence would create tension or conflict. That is the price I paid for doing the right thing. And some days that price feels very high. But I also tell them that despite the cost, despite the pain and the loss and the permanent damage to family relationships, I would make the same choice again. Because the alternative was to watch my grandfather's life work be stolen while he slowly forgot he had ever built anything. The alternative was to let criminals get away with elder abuse because confronting them would be uncomfortable. The alternative was to prioritize family harmony over justice, and I could not live with that choice. I learned that sometimes family is not defined by blood or shared last names, but by who actually shows up when things are hard. My mother and Aunt Linda showed up. Attorney Sullivan showed up. Sarah Chun, the loyal office manager, showed up. Those relationships deepened and strengthened through the battle in ways that would never have happened otherwise. I learned who I could really count on, who had integrity that went beyond convenience, who would fight for what was right even when it cost them something. I also learned about resilience, both my own and my family's. After everything that happened, after the legal battles and the family splits and the public humiliation of having our dysfunction on display in court documents and local news articles, we survived. My mother did not collapse under the weight of managing her father's decline, fighting a legal battle, and maintaining her career. Aunt Linda did not break when her brothers turned on her and tried to make her complicit in their crimes. I did not give up when Uncle Robert's lawyers tried to destroy my credibility and make me look like a delusional kid with an agenda. We were tested in ways we never imagined we would be, and we came through it, not unscathed, not without permanent scars, but we came through it. That knowledge that we survived the worst thing that could have happened to our family gives me confidence that we can handle whatever comes next. The experience also profoundly shaped my understanding of business ethics and responsibility. Before this happened, I thought about business in primarily abstract terms. Profit margins, market share, competitive advantage. Those things still matter, but they are not what actually defines a company's value. What defines a company is how it treats people, the integrity with which it operates, the positive impact it has on its community. Hughes Construction was never just about making money for my grandfather. It was about employing people and giving them dignity through honest work. It was about building things that served the community and would last for generations. It was about operating with such consistent integrity that a handshake was sufficient, that his reputation was his most valuable asset. That is what made the company worth saving. Not the financial value on a balance sheet, but the human value of what it represented and what it enabled. Working at the company now, I try to carry forward that philosophy. When we make decisions about projects to pursue, or employees to hire, or how to handle a client dispute, I think about what Grandpa would have done, not the confused man with dementia who could not remember his own name, but the builder who started with a truck and a toolbox and grew a company through decades of ethical decisions. That version of my grandfather, the one I knew before Alzheimer's stole him, is the standard I try to meet. Sometimes I succeed, sometimes I fall short. Running a business is complex and full of gray areas where the right choice is not obvious. But I keep trying, keep asking myself what would serve not just the company's immediate interests, but its long-term reputation and the community it serves. I figure if I can do that, if I can maintain even a fraction of the integrity my grandfather built into this company's foundation, then everything I went through to save it will have been worth it. I also think about the broader implications of what happened. My family's story is not unique. Elder abuse is an epidemic that often goes unreported because the victims cannot advocate for themselves and because family members look the other way or do not recognize the signs. Financial exploitation is particularly insidious because it can be disguised as helping with money management or protecting assets or making sound business decisions. How many other Robert Hughes are out there right now, systematically stealing from elderly parents or grandparents while everyone assumes they are being helpful? How many vulnerable people are being victimized by the family members who should be protecting them? How many young people like me are seeing something wrong but feeling powerless to act because they are just kids who do not understand adult matters? That is why I speak publicly about my experience now, not for attention or acclaim, but because I want people to know that they can fight back, that justice is possible even when it seems impossibly hard. I want other young people to know that being 20 or 19 or 18 does not disqualify you from standing up against wrongdoing. I want families to know that if something feels off about how an elderly relative's finances are being handled, they should trust that instinct and investigate. And I want potential perpetrators to know that they might get away with it for a while, but eventually someone might notice. Someone might care enough to dig deeper. Someone might be brave enough or stubborn enough or angry enough to fight back. And when that happens, all the expensive lawyers and professional credentials in the world will not protect you if the evidence shows you committed crimes against your own vulnerable family members. The legal system is not perfect. It is slow and expensive and often seems designed to favor those with more resources. But it can work. Truth can prevail. A college kid with recordings and documents and determination can defeat experienced professionals who thought they were untouchable. I am proof of that, and I want everyone facing similar situations to know it is possible. My grandfather died without knowing that I saved his legacy. That is one of my few regrets. I wish he could have understood what I did, could have known that his company survived because his grandson loved him enough to fight for what he built. But Alzheimer's stole that possibility. By the time the legal battle was won, he was too far gone to comprehend any of it. But maybe in some way he does know. Maybe in whatever consciousness exists beyond what we can measure or understand, there is some awareness that his life's work was protected, that his grandson stood up for him when he could not stand up for himself. I would like to think so. I would like to think that somewhere, somehow, William Patrick Hughes knows that his company still exists, still employs people, still builds things that matter, that his legacy was not erased by the greed of his own sons, because one young man refused to look away. Thank you for listening to my story of growing up faster than I ever wanted to. I have left 2 more stories on your screen, both from young men who learned that sometimes becoming an adult does not happen at 18. It happens the moment your family needs you to be strong. Click on whichever one speaks to you. And if you want to join our community of people who understand what it is like to be forced to grow up overnight, that notification bell is waiting. Until tomorrow, remember, age is just a number, but courage defines who you really are.